The crystal chandeliers of Azure Heights cast dancing shadows across the marble floors as Isabella Rodriguez adjusted her black server's apron for the third time that evening. The upscale restaurant in downtown Manhattan attracted the city's elite, and tonight promised to be no different. She glanced at her reflection in the polished silver of a serving tray, tucking a strand of dark hair behind her ear. At 26, she had learned to make herself invisible in places like this, moving between tables like a ghost while wealthy patrons discussed deals worth more than most people earned in a lifetime. The restaurant buzzed with its usual energy. Business executives sealed million-dollar agreements over aged wine. Celebrities dined in corner booths, and politicians whispered about upcoming campaigns. Isabella had worked here for 8 months, ever since her world had collapsed around her. She served these people with a practiced smile, knowing that most barely acknowledged her existence beyond ensuring their glasses stayed full and their plates arrived on time. Table 12 needs their wine selection, called James Chen, the restaurant manager, as he hurried past, carrying a stack of menus. James was one of the few people who treated Isabella with genuine kindness, though he had no idea about her past. To him, she was simply a reliable employee who spoke excellent English and never caused problems. Isabella picked up the leather-bound wine menu and walked gracefully between the tables. Her movements carried an elegance that seemed natural, though she had learned long ago to tone down anything that might draw unwanted attention. She had perfected the art of being competent but unremarkable, helpful but forgettable. Table 12 housed for middle-aged businessmen deep in conversation about quarterly profits and market expansion. Isabella presented the wine menu with her professional smile, but the man closest to her barely glanced up from his phone. His expensive suit and gold watch marked him as someone accustomed to being catered to without question.
Could you explain
the difference between these French wines? One of them asked, pointing to several selections. Speak slowly, though, sweetheart. Some of these foreign terms might be difficult for you. Isabella felt the familiar sting of condescension, but maintained her composure. She patiently explained each wine's characteristics, their regions of origin, and ideal food pairings. Men seemed mildly surprised by her knowledge, but quickly returned to their important conversation about stock options and board meetings. The evening progressed normally until Victor Sterling entered the restaurant. Isabella recognized him immediately. From magazine covers and business news programs, Victor Sterling, a tech billionaire who had built his empire from a small software company into a global corporation worth billions. At 45, he carried himself with the confidence of someone who had never heard the word no applied to himself. His perfectly styled gray hair and custom-tailored suit spoke of wealth that transcended mere money and entered the realm of true power. Behind him walked four distinguished individuals who Isabella could tell were foreign based on their subtle differences in dress and posture. One spoke with what sounded like a German accent, another gestured in a way that seemed distinctly French. The third appeared Japanese, and the fourth carried himself with the formal bearing she associated with Italian business culture. James practically sprinted to greet them, his face lighting up with the special smile reserved for customers who could change the restaurant's fortune with a single recommendation. "Mr. Sterling, what an honor to have you dining with us again. Your usual table is prepared, with the view of the city you prefer." Victor nodded dismissively, as if his presence was indeed a favor he was granting. His international guests followed him to the restaurant's premier table, positioned near floor-to-ceiling windows showcasing Manhattan's glittering skyline. Isabella continued serving her assigned tables, but she noticed James's nervous energy as he supervised every detail of Victor's service. "Isabella," James whispered urgently, appearing at her elbow, "I need you to handle Mr. Sterling's table. Our usual server for VIP guests called in sick, and you're the most professional member of our team. This is extremely important. These are international investors discussing a major deal?" Isabella nodded, understanding the weight of the assignment. She had dealt with demanding customers before, though none quite at Victor Sterling's level of influence. She gathered her order pad and approached the table where Victor was explaining investment opportunities in American technology to his guests. "Good evening, gentlemen," Isabella said with her practiced professional tone. "Welcome to Azure Heights." May I start you with some appetizers or beverages this evening? Victor looked up from his conversation, and Isabella saw his eyes perform the quick assessment she had grown accustomed to from wealthy patrons. She could practically see him categorizing her, filing her away as another service worker whose primary value was her ability to remain unnoticed while meeting his needs. "Do you speak English well?" Victor asked suddenly, interrupting his own business conversation. His tone carried the casual arrogance of someone testing a tool to see if it would function properly. Isabella hesitated for just a moment, unsure where this question was leading. "Yes, sir, I do." Victor smiled, but it was not a warm expression. It was the smile of someone who had just discovered an opportunity for entertainment at someone else's expense. "Excellent. Gentlemen, what do you say we test our server's language skills? It might be interesting to see how well she handles international communication." The four international guests shifted uncomfortably in their seats. The German businessman, a tall man with gold-rimmed glasses, frowned slightly. The French executive, younger than the others, adjusted his tie nervously. The Japanese investor simply shook his head politely, while the Italian gentleman looked genuinely uncomfortable with this suggestion. "Victor, that's really not necessary," the American businessman said quietly. "We can conduct our business in English without any problems." "Nonsense," Victor replied, clearly enjoying the situation he was creating. "This could be educational for everyone involved. Our server here can practice her language skills, and we can see how well American service workers adapt to international business needs." Isabella felt her heart rate increase, but she kept her voice steady. "I don't mind helping however I can, Mr. Sterling." Victor leaned back in his chair, crossing his arms as if preparing to watch a performance. "Perfect. Then let's begin with something simple. Your Hans," he addressed the German businessman. "Why don't you place your order in your native language? Let's see how our multilingual server handles authentic German." Hans Mueller looked apologetically at Isabella and slowly began speaking in German, ordering salmon with lemon sauce and requesting a wine recommendation. His pace was deliberately careful, as if he expected her to struggle with comprehension. Isabella listened attentively, then responded in fluent German, without any trace of an accent. She not only confirmed his order, but suggested a specific Riesling that would complement the salmon perfectly, explaining in detail why the wine's acidity and fruit notes would enhance the dish's flavors. Her pronunciation was flawless, natural, carrying the confidence of someone who had learned the language through immersion rather than textbooks. The silence at the table was profound. Victor's confident smile faltered slightly. Hans raised his eyebrows, clearly impressed, not just with her German fluency, but with her sophisticated knowledge of wine pairings. He accepted her recommendation with a tone of genuine respect that had been absent from his voice moments before. Victor cleared his throat, trying to regain control of the situation he had created. That was adequate. "Now let's try something more challenging. Pierre, please place your order in French." The French executive hesitated, glancing around the table before speaking in rapid, fluent French. He ordered filet mignon cooked medium rare, with a red wine reduction, speaking at normal conversational speed without the careful pronunciation Hans had used. Isabella responded immediately in perfect Parisian French, her accent flawless and sophisticated. She confirmed his order and suggested a Bordeaux from a specific vineyard, explaining in detail how the wine's tannins would complement the meat's richness. She spoke with the natural rhythm and intonation of someone who had lived in France, not merely studied the language. Pierre's mouth fell open slightly. Victor's face was beginning to show signs of irritation, though he was trying to maintain his composure in front of his potential business partners. The atmosphere at the table had shifted dramatically. What had begun as Victor's attempt to demonstrate his superiority was rapidly becoming something entirely different. The international businessmen were looking at Isabella with growing interest and respect, while Victor found himself losing control of a situation he had orchestrated for his own amusement. Isabella stood calmly beside the table, order pad in hand, waiting for whatever challenge would come next. She had spent years hiding who she truly was, but tonight, circumstances were forcing her to reveal abilities she had kept carefully concealed. The question now was how far Victor would push this test, and what consequences his arrogance might ultimately bring upon himself. The tension at table 12 was thick enough to cut with a knife. Victor Sterling's confident demeanor was cracking like ice under pressure as he watched his carefully orchestrated humiliation backfire spectacularly. His international guests were staring at Isabella with expressions ranging from amazement to genuine respect, while Victor struggled to regain control of the situation. "Well, that was interesting," Victor said, his voice slightly strained. "But let's see how you handle something really challenging. Takeshi, why don't you order in Japanese? I'm sure that will be beyond our server's capabilities." Takashi Yamamoto, the Japanese businessman, looked deeply uncomfortable with the entire situation. He was a man in his 50s with kind eyes and impeccable manners, and the forced nature of this test clearly bothered him. "Mr. Sterling, this really isn't necessary. The young lady has already demonstrated remarkable skill." "Please, I insist," Victor pressed, though his smile was becoming more forced by the minute. "Consider it a learning experience for everyone." Takashi sighed quietly and began speaking in formal Japanese, ordering tempura with traditional seasonings and asking about sake selections. His tone was respectful and apologetic, as if he was embarrassed to be part of Victor's game. Isabella bowed slightly in the traditional Japanese manner before responding. Her Japanese was not only fluent but carried the formal politeness levels appropriate for addressing a respected businessman. She confirmed his order in perfect keigo, the honorific form of Japanese used in business settings, and recommended a premium sake that would complement the delicate flavors of tempura. She even explained the brewing process and regional characteristics of the sake in sophisticated terms that demonstrated deep cultural knowledge. Takeshi's eyes widened in genuine shock. He responded in Japanese, asking where she had learned to speak with such formal precision. Isabella replied that she had spent time in Tokyo working with international organizations, maintaining the humble tone expected in Japanese business culture. The entire dynamic at the table had shifted completely. Victor's international guests were now leaning forward, fascinated by Isabella rather than focused on their host. Hans Mueller removed his glasses to clean them, as if he needed to see more clearly to believe what he was witnessing. Pierre was shaking his head in amazement, while Takeshi continued to engage Isabella in polite Japanese conversation. "Enough," Victor snapped, his composure finally cracking. "This is supposed to be a business dinner, not a language exhibition. Roberto, just order in English so we can move on." Roberto Benedetti, the Italian businessman, was a distinguished man with silver hair and an air of old-world elegance. He had been watching the entire exchange with growing disapproval, not at Isabella's performance, but at Victor's behavior. "Actually, Victor, I find this quite fascinating. May I ask your name?" "Isabella Rodriguez, sir," she replied with quiet dignity. "Isabella, a beautiful Italian name. Tell me, do you perhaps speak Italian as well?" Isabella hesitated, glancing at Victor, whose face was growing redder by the moment.
"Ah, sir, I do."
Roberto smiled warmly and began speaking in rapid Italian, not as a test, but as a genuine conversation. He asked about her background, her family, and how she had learned so many languages. His tone was kind and respectful, treating her as an equal rather than entertainment. Isabella responded in flawless Italian with a slight Roman accent, explaining that she had learned many languages through travel and work with international organizations. Her Italian was sophisticated and nuanced, carrying the cultural depth that comes from real immersion in the language and culture. Roberto's face lit up with delight. He continued the conversation, discussing Italian literature and culture, and Isabella responded with knowledge that impressed even him. They spoke about regional dialects, historical connections between Italy and Latin America, and the evolution of Romance languages. "Incredible," Roberto murmured in English, turning to the others. "This young woman speaks Italian better than some of my colleagues in Rome. Her accent is perfect and her cultural knowledge is remarkable." Victor slammed his hand on the table, causing water glasses to rattle. "That's enough. This is ridiculous. You're all being fooled by some parlor tricks." She probably memorized a few phrases to impress tourists. The statement hung in the air like a physical insult. The international businessmen exchanged glances that spoke volumes about their changing opinion of Victor Sterling. Isabella felt something inside her shift, A dormant strength awakening after months of keeping her head down and accepting condescension? "Mr. Sterling," she said quietly, her voice carrying a new tone of authority that made everyone at the table look at her more carefully. "If you doubt my abilities, perhaps you would like me to demonstrate my fluency in Mandarin Chinese as well. Or maybe Portuguese. I also speak Arabic and Russian if that would convince you." The silence that followed was deafening. Even the conversations at nearby tables seemed to pause as if the entire restaurant sensed that something significant was happening. Hans Mueller was the first to speak. "8 languages? You speak 8 languages fluently?" "Yes, sir. I've studied international relations and worked as a diplomatic interpreter before circumstances changed my life path." Pierre leaned forward, his business dinner forgotten. "You worked as a diplomatic interpreter? For which organizations?" Isabella looked directly at Victor, who was staring at her with a mixture of shock and growing anger. "I worked for the United Nations, various embassies, and international trade organizations. I specialized in multilateral negotiations and cultural mediation." Takeshi spoke up in wonder. "That explains your perfect use of formal Japanese business language. You learned it in professional diplomatic settings." "Yes, sir. Spent 2 years in Tokyo working with trade delegations and another year in Beijing with cultural exchange programs." Roberto shook his head in amazement. "And now you're working as a server? What happened? With those qualifications, you could work for any major international corporation or government agency." Isabella felt the weight of her story pressing against her chest, years of hiding and diminishing herself to survive. "Sometimes life doesn't go according to plan, sir. Sometimes we do what we must to survive while we rebuild." Victor's face was now completely red with embarrassment and rage. "This is all very touching, but I didn't come here for a sob story. You're a waitress. That's your job. So do it and stop wasting our time with these ridiculous claims." The insult hit like a physical blow, but instead of shrinking away as she had for months, Isabella felt her backbone straighten. The professional confidence she had spent years building before her world collapsed came flooding back. "Mr. Sterling," she said, her voice now carrying the authoritative tone she had once used in international conferences, "my qualifications include a master's degree in international relations from Georgetown University, certification in simultaneous interpretation from the International Association of Conference Interpreters, and 5 years of experience mediating disputes between multinational corporations and governments. I have negotiated trade agreements worth billions of dollars and helped resolve international conflicts through diplomatic dialogue." She paused, letting the weight of her words settle over the table. "So yes, I am currently working as a server because life circumstances force me to start over, but that doesn't change who I am or what I'm capable of achieving." The 4 international businessmen stared at her in complete amazement. These were men who worked at the highest levels of global business, and they recognized authentic expertise. When they encountered it, Hans was the first to recover from his shock. "Georgetown University. That's one of the most prestigious international relations programs in the world. And you worked for the UN?" "Yes, sir. I specialized in economic, diplomacy, and cultural mediation. I helped design framework agreements for international trade partnerships." Pierre was shaking his head in disbelief. "Victor, do you realize what you've done? This woman could be consulting for our companies instead of serving our dinner." "Experience is exactly what we need for international expansion." Takeshi nodded emphatically. "In Japan, we have deep respect for such qualifications. Ms. Rodriguez, your expertise would be invaluable for companies seeking to navigate complex international markets." Roberto looked directly at Victor with undisguised disapproval. "This is embarrassing, Victor. You brought us here to discuss business partnerships, but instead you've been humiliating someone whose professional credentials exceed those of many people in our industry." Victor's carefully constructed image was crumbling before his eyes. The international investors he had been courting were now looking at him with the kind of disdain usually reserved for amateur con artists trying to infiltrate serious business circles. "You're all being manipulated," Victor sputtered desperately. "She's probably lying about everything. These are just claims anyone could make." Isabella reached into her server's apron and pulled out her phone. With a few quick touches, She brought up her LinkedIn profile, her university transcripts, and letters of recommendation from former colleagues at the United Nations. She handed the phone to Hans, who began reading with growing amazement. "This is all verified," Hans said, passing the phone to Pierre. "Look at these recommendations." She worked on the UN Trade Facilitation Agreement. She was part of the team that negotiated the Pacific Regional Partnership Protocols. Pierre whistled softly as he read. Her supervisor at the UN called her one of the most gifted cultural mediators of her generation. Victor. This woman is exactly the kind of international consultant our companies pay hundreds of thousands of dollars to retain. Taxi examined the phone when it reached him. She has certifications I've never seen outside of senior diplomatic circles. This level of expertise typically requires decades to develop. Victor was trapped in a nightmare of his own making. What had begun as his attempt to amuse himself by humiliating a server had become the complete destruction of his credibility in front of potential business partners worth hundreds of millions of dollars. But Isabella wasn't finished. She had spent 8 months accepting condescension and hiding her light under a bushel, and something inside her had finally snapped back to life. "Mr. Sterling," she said with the calm authority of someone who had once commanded respect in rooms filled with world leaders, "I want to thank you for this evening. You've reminded me of something very important." She looked around the table at the 4 international businessmen who were now hanging on her every word. "You've reminded me that I don't have to hide who I am anymore. I don't have to accept being treated as less than I am simply because current circumstances don't reflect my full capabilities." The power in the room had shifted completely, and everyone could feel it. Isabella Rodriguez was no longer just a server taking orders. She was reclaiming her identity as a skilled international professional, and it was magnificent to witness. The atmosphere in Azure Heights had completely transformed. Other diners had begun to notice the commotion at table 12, where a server was engaged in what appeared to be a high-level business discussion with some of the restaurant's most important guests. James Chen watched nervously from across the room, unsure whether to intervene or simply observe what was clearly an unprecedented situation. Isabella stood beside the table with newfound confidence. No longer the invisible server who had walked into work that evening. The international businessmen looked at her with the respect typically reserved for senior executives, while Victor Sterling appeared to be having some kind of internal breakdown as his carefully planned evening disintegrated around him. "Miss Rodriguez," Hans Mueller said, standing up from his chair, "I believe we need to have a serious conversation about your future. What you've demonstrated tonight suggests you're significantly underemployed in your current position." Pierre nodded enthusiastically. "My company has been searching for someone with exactly your background to head our Latin American expansion. We need someone who can navigate both American business culture and international markets with equal expertise." Takeshi also rose from his seat. "In Japanese business culture, we believe that talent should never be wasted. Miss Rodriguez, your qualifications suggest you could be consulting for major international corporations rather than working in food service." Roberto smiled warmly. "My family's company has operations throughout Europe and South America. We desperately need someone with your diplomatic background and cultural understanding to help coordinate our international partnerships." Isabella felt overwhelmed by the sudden attention and opportunities being presented to her. For 8 months, she had convinced herself that her old life was gone forever, that she would never again work in the field she loved. Now, in the space of one evening, 4 successful international businessmen were essentially offering her a way back to her true calling. "Gentlemen, I'm incredibly honored by your interest," she began, but Victor interrupted her with a harsh laugh. "This is absolutely ridiculous," Victor snapped, his voice loud enough to draw stares from other tables. "You're all being taken in by an elaborate act. She's a waitress, nothing more. These claims about working for the UN are probably complete fabrications designed to manipulate you into feeling sorry for her." The accusation hung in the air like poison, and Isabella felt the familiar pain of being dismissed and diminished. But this time, instead of accepting the insult quietly, she felt her professional training kick in. Years of handling difficult negotiations and managing international conflicts had taught her how to deal with unreasonable people. "Mr. Sterling," she said with the calm, measured tone she had once used to de-escalate tensions between hostile Governments. Your skepticism is understandable, but it's also easily resolved. She pulled out her phone again and dialed a number from memory. The phone rang twice before a familiar voice answered. Ambassador Patricia Williams speaking. Ambassador Williams, this is Isabella Rodriguez. I apologize for calling you so late, but I have a professional situation that requires immediate verification of my credentials. The voice on the other end immediately warmed. Isabella, my dear, how wonderful to hear from you. We've been wondering what happened to you after your parents passed. How can I help? Isabella put the phone on speaker so the table could hear. Ambassador, I'm currently with some international businessmen who have questions about my background and qualifications. Would you mind confirming my work history with the United Nations? Of course, dear. Gentleman, Isabella Rodriguez was one of our most valued diplomatic interpreters and cultural mediators. She worked on some of our most sensitive international negotiations, including the Trade Facilitation Agreement and the Pacific Regional Partnership Protocols. Her linguistic abilities and cultural understanding made her invaluable in situations where communication breakdowns could have cost billions and lost trade opportunities. The ambassador continued, Isabella's departure from diplomatic service was a significant loss to our organization. She left to care for family matters after a personal tragedy, but we would welcome her back at any time. Her skills are absolutely extraordinary, and any organization would be fortunate to have her expertise. Victor's face had gone completely pale. The international businessmen were nodding as if everything suddenly made perfect sense. Thank you, Ambassador Williams, Isabella said. I'll call you soon to catch up properly. Please do, dear. And remember, your talents are too valuable to waste. The international community needs people like you. Isabella ended the call and looked directly at Victor. Does that satisfy your concerns about my qualifications, Mr. Sterling? Victor opened his mouth to respond, but no words came out. He had been completely and publicly humiliated, and everyone at the table knew it. Hans turned to Victor with unconcealed disgust. Victor, what you've done tonight is shameful. You attempted to humiliate a highly qualified professional for your own amusement, and in doing so, you've revealed more about your character than I care to know. Pierre shook his head. In France, we have a saying about treating all people with dignity because you never know who they might truly be. You've demonstrated why that wisdom exists. Takeshi's formal politeness had evaporated, placed by the cold professionalism of someone terminating a business relationship. Mr. Sterling, I don't believe our companies share compatible values. We will not be moving forward with any partnership discussions. Roberto was equally blunt. Victor, I've seen enough of your character tonight to know that my family would never want to do business with you. The way you treat people when you think they can't fight back tells me everything I need to know about your integrity. Victor looked around the table desperately as he watched hundreds of millions of dollars in potential partnerships vanish because of his own arrogance. Wait, you're all overreacting. This is just a misunderstanding. We can work this out. No, Hans said firmly. We cannot. You deliberately tried to humiliate someone you perceived as powerless. And when that person turned out to be more qualified than you expected, you accused her of lying and manipulation. That's not the kind of person my company associates with. The four businessmen began gathering their belongings, clearly preparing to leave. But before they departed, they each turned their attention back to Isabella. Miss Rodriguez, Hans said, reaching into his jacket for a business card. I would very much like to discuss employment opportunities with you. My company needs someone with your exact qualifications to head our international division. Pierre handed her his card as well. We should talk about consulting opportunities. Your background is precisely what we need for our global expansion plans. Takeshi bowed slightly as he presented his card with both hands in the traditional Japanese manner. Please consider joining our Cultural Advisory Board. Your experience would be invaluable for our American operations. Roberto smiled warmly as he gave her his contact information. My family's business has been successful for generations because we recognize talent when we see it. I hope we can find a way to work together. Isabella stood holding 4 business cards, each representing opportunities that could completely transform her life. The invisible server who had walked into work that evening was gone, replaced by a confident international professional who had just been courted by some of the world's most successful businessmen. As the 4 men prepared to leave, Hans turned back to Victor one final time. You know, Victor, tonight you thought you were testing her, but you were actually testing yourself. You failed spectacularly. The international businessman left the restaurant together, talking animatedly about Isabella's qualifications and discussing ways they might be able to work with her. Their departure left Victor sitting alone at table 12, surrounded by the wreckage of his reputation and the complete destruction of his business plans. Isabella looked down at the business cards in her hands, then at Victor, who was staring at the table in shocked silence. For a moment, she almost felt sorry for him. "Almost, Mr. Sterling," she said quietly. "I want you to remember something. Tonight, you tried to humiliate me because you thought I was powerless. You assumed that? Because I was serving tables, I must be less intelligent, less educated, and less worthy of respect than you are." She leaned slightly closer to the table. "But here's what you failed to understand. A person's current circumstances don't define their worth or their capabilities. You looked at me and saw only a waitress. Those gentlemen looked at me and saw a skilled professional who happened to be working as a waitress." Victor finally looked up at her, his eyes filled with the dawning realization of what his arrogance had cost him. "The difference between you and them," Isabella continued, "is that they understood something fundamental about leadership and success. True leaders recognize talent wherever they find it and treat all people with dignity. You, on the other hand, revealed yourself to be exactly the kind of person they would never want to do business with." She straightened up, smoothing her server's apron one final time. "I want to thank you, Mr. Sterling. Tonight you reminded me of who I really am. You forced me to stop hiding and start believing in myself again. In trying to tear me down, you actually helped me remember my worth." Isabella turned and walked toward James, who had been watching the entire scene unfold with complete bewilderment. She handed him her apron and order pad. "James, I'm sorry for the commotion tonight. You've been incredibly kind to me, and I'll always be grateful for that. But I think it's time for me to return to the career I was meant for." James looked at the business cards in her hand, then at Victor sitting alone and defeated at table 12. "Isabella, I don't fully understand what just happened here tonight, but I can see that your life is about to change dramatically." She smiled, and for the first time in months, it was a smile filled with genuine hope and excitement about the future. "Yes, James, I think it is." As Isabella walked out of Azure Heights for the last time, she felt like she was stepping out of a long, dark tunnel and into the bright light of a new beginning. Behind her, Victor Sterling sat alone at his table, finally understanding the true cost of treating people as if their only value was their ability to serve his ego. The invisible server had become visible again, but this time she was visible as exactly who she had always been, a brilliant, accomplished international professional who had simply been waiting for the right moment to reclaim her destiny, and that moment had finally arrived.